It began with a storm, the kind that didn't just rattle the windows, but seemed to reach straight into your chest. Rain drove against the coast of Oregon like nails, and the wind moaned through the cracks of an old lighthouse that hadn't guided a ship in 10 years. Inside, a single lamp flickered in the hands of Arthur Hale, a retired keeper who refused to leave the sea behind. The tower was abandoned by everyone else, the Coast Guard, the fishermen, even the tourists who once came to take pictures of its lonely beauty. But not Arthur. He stayed. Because some lights he believed were never meant to go out. Every night, he sat by the narrow window logging the weather in a leather notebook that nobody would ever read. Every morning, he'd stare at the horizon where the sea swallowed the sun and think of his wife, the one who used to say, "The ocean doesn't keep secrets, Arthur. It just waits until you're ready to listen." She'd been gone 7 years. The house had grown quiet since then, but on this night, the silence broke. It came from beyond the cliffs, a sound raw and ancient, cutting through the storm like a memory with teeth. A howl. Arthur froze, the pen trembling in his hand. Wolves didn't belong here, not this close to the salt air, not where the land ended in stone and surf. Yet the sound came again, longer this time, almost mournful. He stood, walked to the fogged window, and pressed his hand against the cold glass. Lightning split the sky for a brief, merciless second, and there it was, a shape, a silhouette standing on the black edge of the cliffs, fur slick with rain eyes, reflecting the dying light from his lamp. A wolf, alone, facing the storm. Arthur whispered without thinking, "You again. What are you looking for out there?" The words disappeared into the wind. Outside, the animal didn't move. It just stood there, staring toward the sea, as if guarding something he could not see. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the lightning faded. The world went dark again, leaving Arthur alone with the sound of rain and a single heartbeat that wasn't entirely his own. He sat back down, feeling the old floor creak beneath him. The lamp's flame shivered in the draft, painting the walls in trembling gold. For a moment, he thought about the hundreds of nights he'd spent guiding lost sailors through fog and fury. Back then, every flash of light meant a life saved. Every silence meant someone who didn't make it home. And now maybe the sea had sent him another lost soul. Arthur leaned forward, staring out into the void where the cliffs vanished into foam. The wind died for a single breath. In that stillness, the lighthouse seemed to hum, as if remembering what it once was. Then, from somewhere deep in the dark, the wolf howled again. The sound echoed through the stone walls, rising, falling, merging with the sea, until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It was a voice both wild and familiar, like the ocean calling him by name. He whispered to no one, "Maybe you're not lost after all." The rain softened, the flames steadied, but Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching, not with hunger, but with purpose. Out there beyond the reach of the dead light, something waited. And as the waves crashed against the cliffs, he knew this night was different. He didn't yet understand why or how or what it meant, only that it had begun. What happened next would make even the ocean hold its breath. It began with a storm, the kind that didn't just rattle the windows, but seemed to reach straight into your chest. Rain drove against the coast of Oregon like nails, and the wind moaned through the cracks of an old lighthouse that hadn't guided a ship in 10 years. Inside, a single lamp flickered in the hands of Arthur Hale, a retired keeper who refused to leave the sea behind. The tower was abandoned by everyone else, the Coast Guard, the fishermen, even the tourists who once came to take pictures of its lonely beauty. But not Arthur. He stayed, because some lights he believed were never meant to go out. Every night, he sat by the narrow window, logging the weather in a leather notebook that nobody would ever read. Every morning, he'd stare at the horizon where the sea swallowed the sun, and think of his wife, the one who used to say, "The ocean doesn't keep secrets." Arthur, it just waits until you're ready to listen. She'd been gone 7 years. The house had grown quiet since then. But on this night, the silence broke. It came from beyond the cliffs, a sound raw and ancient cutting through the storm like a memory with teeth. A howl. Arthur froze the pen trembling in his hand. Wolves didn't belong here, not this close to the salt air, not where the land ended in stone and surf. Yet the sound came again, longer this time, almost mournful. He stood, walked to the fogged window, and pressed his hand against the cold glass. Lightning split the sky for a brief, merciless second, and there it was. A shape. A silhouette, standing on the black edge of the cliffs, fur slick with rain, eyes reflecting the dying light from his lamp. A wolf. Alone. Facing the storm. Arthur whispered without thinking, "You again. What are you looking for out there?" The words disappeared into the wind. Outside, the animal didn't move. It just stood there staring toward the sea, as if guarding something he could not see. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the lightning faded. The world went dark again, leaving Arthur alone with the sound of rain and a single heartbeat that wasn't entirely his own. He sat back down, feeling the old floor creak beneath him. The lamp's flame shivered in the draft, painting the walls in trembling gold. For a moment, he thought about the hundreds of nights he'd spent guiding lost sailors through fog and fury. Back then, every flash of light meant a life saved. Every silence meant someone who didn't make it home. And now, maybe the sea had sent him another lost soul. Arthur leaned forward, staring out into the void, where the cliffs vanished into foam. The wind died for a single breath. In that stillness, the lighthouse seemed to hum, as if remembering what it once was. Then, from somewhere deep in the dark, the wolf howled again. The sound echoed through the stone walls, rising, falling, merging with the sea, until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It was a voice both wild and familiar, like the ocean calling him by name. He whispered to no one, "Maybe you're not lost after all." The rain softened, the flame steadied, but Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching, not with hunger, but with purpose. Out there beyond the reach of the dead light, something waited. And as the waves crashed against the cliffs, he knew this night was different. He didn't yet understand why or how or what it meant, only that it had begun. What happened next would make even the ocean hold its breath. The third night after the storm, the wind carried no rain, only the ghost of it. The sea had settled into a slow rhythm, breathing in and out like a tired animal. Arthur Hale stood on the balcony of the lighthouse again, the same mug of coffee cooling in his hands, watching the mist drift between the rocks. The days had begun to blur together. He'd spent most of them scanning the cliffs through his old binoculars, searching for what logic insisted wasn't there. But the tracks had been real. The howls had been real. Something was out there, and it had chosen this place, his place to return to. By dusk, the fog thickened into a wall of gray. The sound of the sea was muffled, as if the whole world were holding its breath. Arthur pulled on his coat, grabbed his lantern, and descended the spiral stairs. The metal steps groaned under his weight, echoing into the hollow heart of the tower. Outside, the air tasted like salt and cold iron. He followed the narrow path down toward the cliffs, the light from his lantern trembling against the rocks. The fog swallowed everything beyond 10 paces. He paused near the driftwood log, where he'd found the tracks before, and froze. Another print. Fresh, the edges still crisp. His pulse quickened. He lifted the lantern higher. A gust of wind parted the fog just enough to reveal movement, a shape slipping through it like smoke. And then there it was. The wolf stood at the edge of the cliff facing the ocean. Its coat was the color of storm clouds, gray streaked with silver, and rain still clung to its fur, though the sky had been clear for hours. The animal's body was lean but powerful, its stance calm, deliberate. It didn't look at Arthur, not at first. Its gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, where the sun sank behind the dark waves. Arthur didn't move either. Something about the moment felt sacred fragile. He was close enough now to hear the slow, measured sound of the wolf's breathing. Finally, it turned its head. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the distance between man and wild vanished. Arthur had seen Storm's death, and every kind of fear the sea could conjure, but nothing like this. The wolf's eyes weren't feral. They were alive in another way, ancient knowing. He whispered almost reverently, "You're not lost, are you?" The wolf tilted its head slightly as if it had heard him. Then it looked back toward the sea and lifted its muzzle to the wind. The howl that followed was low and long, rolling across the cliffs and spilling into the waves. Arthur felt the sound in his chest more than in his ears, a vibration that reached somewhere he hadn't touched in years. It wasn't loneliness. It was recognition. The wolf stopped, lowered its head, and began to walk along the ridge paws, silent on the wet stone. Arthur followed from a distance, careful not to startle it. The path curved along the edge of the cliff where the rocks fell away to the foam below. Halfway across, the wolf stopped again. It looked back once, not in fear, but in acknowledgement, and then vanished into the fog. Arthur stood there long after it was gone, the lantern burning low, the mist cooling his face. For the first time in a decade, he felt something other than the dull ache of routine. When he returned to the lighthouse, he sat at his desk and opened his weather log again. His handwriting shook as he wrote, "Saw him, clear as day. Looked toward the sea, not afraid. Neither was I." He stared at the words until they blurred. Then, almost without thinking, he tore a page from the logbook, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his pocket, as if proof of the encounter needed to be carried close to his heart. That night, the wind changed direction. The sea calmed. The fog retreated further than it had in months. Arthur dreamed of standing on the cliff beside the wolf, both of them looking out toward a dark horizon where a faint light blinked once, twice, like a memory refusing to die. And when he woke, the lighthouse walls were humming again softly, like something waiting to be remembered. The next few nights blurred into one long vigil. Arthur found himself lighting the small oil lamp earlier than usual, long before sunset, long before any storm clouds gathered. He told himself it was habit, but it wasn't. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. He was waiting. The first time he saw the wolf again, the fog had barely rolled in. A sliver of moonlight traced the cliffs like a blade, and there on the ridge just beyond the fence, a silhouette stood still as a statue. The wolf, watching the sea again, watching him. Arthur raised the lantern higher, its beam trembling across the mist. The light reached the animal's face for an instant, enough to catch the glint of its eyes, yellow-gray like weathered glass. Then, the fog swallowed everything again. He should have been afraid, but fear had long since left him. Instead, something inside him stirred a quiet reverence, the kind you feel in church or in the moments before dawn, when the world is still deciding whether to begin again. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, keeping the light burning the way he used to for ships. Only this time, it wasn't sailors he was guiding. It was something far older, far lonelier. It started with a whisper, a soft wind sliding down from the mountains, stirring the pine needles, rippling the black water below the cliffs. But by nightfall, the whisper had grown teeth. The barometer on Arthur's table dropped so fast, it made the glass hum. He knew that sound, the kind that came before the sea decided to take something back. A storm was coming, a real one. By dusk, the horizon was gone, swallowed whole by walls of cloud that pulsed with silent lightning. The Coast Guard radio crackled with static warnings: gale force winds, waves exceeding 30 feet, vessels advised to stay docked. Arthur turned the dial lower. He didn't need the broadcast. He could feel it. The lighthouse itself seemed to shudder in anticipation, every beam creaking, as if the old structure remembered what it meant to stand against fury. He climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room and pressed his hand to the cold glass. Beyond it, the world was already disappearing. Fog swirled thick and white. Rain streaked sideways like needles of glass. And through it all, he could swear he heard a faint, distant cry, not of the wind, but of something alive. The wolf. Arthur rushed down the stairs, coat half-buttoned, lantern in hand. The air outside was a roar. He could barely breathe as he stepped onto the balcony. Lightning split the sky for one blinding instant. The cliffs below came alive, waves exploding against the rocks, spray flying higher than the tower itself. And there, just for a heartbeat, he saw it, a gray shape standing in the storm. The wolf, soaked, unmoving, facing the sea. The sight struck him like a revelation. The creature wasn't hiding. It wasn't running. It was standing guard. Arthur's breath caught. He looked toward the ocean and saw far beyond the chaos of the waves a faint flicker of orange. A flare. A distress signal. Somewhere out there, a ship was in trouble. The radio crackled again, faint through the wind: Mayday, Mayday. Lost power. Coordinates. Approaching rocks. The voice dissolved into static. Arthur stared at the dead light above him, the massive Fresnel lens that hadn't shone in 10 years. The government had sealed it, said it was obsolete. But in that moment, looking at the storm, at the flare, at the wolf below, he knew what he had to do. He climbed. Every step groaned beneath his boots. The wind hammered the tower. Water seeped through the cracks, dripping down like sweat from stone. At the top, he ripped the lock off the old fuel panel, hands trembling. He hadn't done this in years, but his body remembered the rhythm of the keeper, the ritual of light. He primed the lines, opened the vents, struck the match. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then fire bloomed. The great lamp coughed, sputtered, and came alive, a blazing sun trapped in glass. Light burst through the fog like resurrection. It sliced through rain and darkness, reaching far into the black sea where the flare had vanished. Arthur leaned against the glass, panting, tears mixing with rain. "Come on," he whispered to whoever was out there. "See it. See the light." Below, lightning lit the cliffs, and the wolf stood there, head lifted, fur whipping in the wind, howling into the storm. The sound pierced through thunder and sea spray, an echo that seemed to call the world back from chaos. For one breathless second, man and beast were mirrors, two silhouettes standing against the wrath of nature, both keepers of something sacred. Out there, through the sheets of rain, a faint light blinked in response. The ship had seen them. Arthur stayed at the lamp for hours, feeding it fuel, keeping it burning as the storm screamed around him. The glass shook, the tower swayed, bolts groaned in the wind. Yet the light held steady and fierce. When the storm finally broke, dawn came pale and exhausted. The sea was littered with debris, pieces of crates, rope, broken wood, but no wreckage. He stumbled down to the cliffs, coat-torn, muscles trembling. The air smelled of salt and smoke. Where the wolf had stood, the ground was covered in paw prints, deep, sharp, deliberate. He followed them a few yards, then stopped. A trail of blood, faint but visible, led into the pine shadows near the ridge. The wolf had been there through it all, and now it was gone again. Arthur turned back toward the tower. The great lamp still burned weakly, its lens fogged with salt. He touched the railing, feeling the vibration of the storm still echoing through metal. "Thank you," he whispered, not to the sea, not to the ship, but to the wild silence that lingered on the wind. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a relic guarding an empty shore. He felt alive. He raised his face to the dawn. The clouds tore open just enough to let one slant of gold strike the tower's glass. The light, old, fragile, stubborn glowed one last time before fading back to gray. Arthur smiled. "We did it," he said softly. Somewhere far out on the horizon, a ship's horn answered. And from deep within the trees, carried faintly through the mist, came the last echo of a howl. Morning came with gulls screaming above the surf. Arthur brewed coffee and stepped outside, boots sinking into wet sand. Near the edge of the cliff, he found them tracks again. But this time there was blood in one. He crouched, heart tightening, a smear of crimson in the mud, faint but fresh. He looked around and spotted a tuft of gray fur snagged on a splinter of driftwood. "Injured," he muttered. Damn it. Every instinct screamed at him to follow, to find the creature, to help. But the rules were clear and etched deep in his mind after decades near wildlife territory. Never approach, never interfere. Wolves were protected by law. Touching one could mean a fine or worse. He stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his coat, the sea growling below. Then he did the only thing he could. That night, he cleaned the old lantern room, wiped the salt off the glass, polished the brass trim, even refilled the ancient fuel system he hadn't touched in years. And when the sky turned black and the fog rolled in, he lit it. The beam cut through the dark like a blade of memory. The lighthouse, long dead, breathed again. From the cliffs below, the sound came almost immediately. A howl. Arthur froze mid-step, heart hammering. The tone was different now, not the strong, rolling call he'd heard before, but something strained, weaker. Still, it answered the light. He leaned against the railing, eyes scanning the fog. The beam swept across the rocks over the surf, and there, for a fraction of a second, he saw it. The wolf standing at the edge of the sea leg, slightly raised, head tilted toward the glowing tower. The rain had started again, soft and silver. The creature didn't move, didn't hide. It simply looked up as if to say, "I see you," Arthur whispered, "and I see you too." He left the light burning through the night. Days turned into a rhythm, light at dusk. Howl at midnight, silence by dawn. Arthur began to speak aloud while he worked, to the sea, to the wind, to the wolf. Sometimes it felt foolish. Other times it was the only thing keeping him sane. "Do you come here because of the light?" he'd ask the empty air. Or, "You know I used to guide men through worse storms than this." No answer ever came, just the echo of the waves and the faraway cry of something alive. He started referring to the animal in his journal as the Watcher. Under each date, he'd write, "The Watcher came again tonight. He stayed longer. The limp's improving." It felt like prayer. One morning, a small group of state rangers arrived unannounced. Their truck rolled up the dirt road, tires crunching gravel. Arthur met them on the porch lantern, soot still on his hands. Mr. Hale, the younger one, said, adjusting his hat, "We've had reports of wolf activity near the cliffs. You seen anything unusual lately?" Arthur's gaze flicked to the horizon, then back. "Just storms," he said. "Same as always." The ranger nodded slowly, unconvinced. "If you do, don't try to help it. Coastal wolves don't usually come this far west. Could be injured or disoriented. We'll handle it." Arthur forced a smile. Of course. When they left, he waited until the sound of the engine faded before climbing to the lantern room. The beam had gone cold, but the room still smelled of smoke and salt. He pressed his palm against the glass, looking out toward the sea. "I'm not helping you," he murmured, "just keeping the light on." Below, the fog began to rise again, slow, deliberate, almost sentient, and somewhere within it, faint and distant, came the answering sound, a low, steady howl that wrapped itself around the tower like an oath. Arthur closed his eyes, the sound settling deep in his bones. He had guided ships his whole life. Now it seemed he was guiding something else, or maybe it was guiding him. Either way, the light stayed burning. By mid-morning, the sea was quiet again, too quiet. The kind of silence that follows something powerful, as if the world itself were catching its breath. Arthur Hale stood on the balcony of the lighthouse, his coat torn, his hands black with soot. The lamp above still burned faintly, coughing smoke from the last of its oil. He had done what he swore he'd never do again, reignited a dead light. And because of that, lives were saved. He could feel it in his bones, the way he'd once felt the hum of ships steering clear of disaster. But he also knew what came next. Trouble. It didn't take long. By noon, a white pickup with the U.S. Coast Guard logo wound its way up the dirt road to the lighthouse. The crunch of tires on gravel carried through the fog, followed by the slam of doors and the sharp voices of men used to command. Arthur Hale. He turned. 3 officers stood by the fence, their uniforms spotless despite the mud. One of them, younger, clipboard in hand, frowned up at the tower. "Did you light that beacon last night?" Arthur hesitated. The truth felt too heavy to say out loud. "I did what I had to," he finally answered. There was a distress flare. A vessel was going down. The officer scribbled something on his sheet. "You're aware that activating a decommissioned light without authorization is a federal violation." Arthur gave a small, dry smile. "And you're aware that if I hadn't, you'd be pulling bodies out of the water right now." The man's expression didn't change. Bureaucracy rarely blinked at heroism. "We'll need to file a report. You'll likely face a fine. Maybe more." Arthur nodded. "Do what you must." The oldest of the 3 officers lingered a moment longer, looking past him toward the cliffs. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, "did anyone else assist you during the storm?" Arthur frowned. "No." "Why?" The man pointed toward the rocks below. "There were prints, large ones, not human. We followed them halfway up the ridge before they disappeared." Arthur's pulse skipped. "Wolves," he said softly. The officer shrugged. "Impossible. Too close to the coast. Probably a stray dog." But his tone carried doubt. Arthur didn't argue. Some things weren't meant to be explained. That evening, reporters arrived. A local paper from Newport first, then a regional news van from Portland. They took photos of the tower, the soot, the salt-streaked glass. One young woman, her hair whipping in the wind, called up to him. "Mr. Hale, locals say there was a wolf seen near the lighthouse the night you relit it. Can you confirm that?" Arthur's grip tightened on the railing. He could have told them the truth, that the wolf had stood in the heart of the storm like a sentinel, that its eyes had reflected the fire of the lamp as if it had been guarding it. But he didn't. He just said, maybe the sea wanted company. The headline the next morning read, "The Ghost Wolf of Yakina Head, the light that saved a ship." The article went viral. Tourists began showing up at the base of the cliffs with cameras and binoculars. Someone even made a Facebook page, "The Phantom Guardian of the Oregon Coast." The Coast Guard wasn't amused. Arthur received an official notice a week later. The letter was short, bureaucratic, and cold. Any further interference with federal navigation property will result in legal action. Please vacate the premises within 30 days. He read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it beside his logbook. The wind outside rattled the window panes. That night, the fog returned. Arthur lit the small lamp in his window, not the great lens this time, but enough to remind him of what the light meant. He waited. For hours nothing moved, only the slow rhythm of waves against stone. Then, faintly, a shape emerged on the ridge. The wolf. It limped slightly now, but still stood tall, head high, fur glowing silver under the moonlight. Arthur whispered through the glass, "They think you're a ghost." The wolf tilted its head as if the word ghost amused it. For a moment, man and beast watched each other in silence. Then the animal turned, slipping into the forest's edge. Arthur stayed by the window until dawn, heart full of something that wasn't sadness, wasn't fear, but gratitude. He didn't care what the world thought. He knew what he'd seen. And some truths he decided are too wild to survive translation. By the end of the month, the Coast Guard padlocked the base of the lighthouse. Arthur packed what little he owned, a few books, his log, a tin box of photographs, and left the rest. As he turned down the dirt road for the last time, he looked back once. The tower stood silent against the gray sky, proud and empty. But in that silence, he imagined he could still hear a sound drifting through the wind, faint, distant, but real. A howl. He smiled. "Keep watch for me, old friend." Then, he started the engine and drove away, the light fading in his rearview mirror until it became nothing but a memory, and maybe a legend. The lighthouse had never looked smaller. From the road below, Arthur could see its outline against the pale sky, a gray tooth jutting out of the cliffs, swallowed by fog. A no trespassing sign hung across the gate, flapping weakly in the wind. It had been a month since he'd left. He'd tried to live inland in a rented room above a diner in Toledo. The air smelled of coffee and asphalt instead of salt, and the nights were too quiet. No wind, no waves, no light sweeping across the dark. He told himself he'd moved on. But every morning he woke before dawn, heart beating to a rhythm that no longer existed. The silence wasn't peace. It was absence. One morning, as the first rain of autumn began to fall, Arthur packed his things into his truck. No one asked where he was going. He doubted anyone cared. The road to Yaquina Head was slick with mud. The wind pushed against the truck like a living thing, as if trying to turn him back. But Arthur kept driving until the land ended and the sea began. He parked near the old service road and started walking. The air was colder than he remembered. Every step echoed against the stones, like footsteps in a church. The lighthouse stood waiting, padlocked and silent, its glass windows clouded with salt. But even through the haze, he could see the faint outline of the great lens dormant, but not dead. He rested a hand on the metal door. It was cold, unyielding. "You did your job," he whispered. "We both did." The wind answered low and steady, carrying with it the familiar tang of the ocean and something else. He followed the smell down toward the cliffs, boots sinking into wet sand. The tide was low, the waves soft and white. For a moment, it almost felt like the sea was asleep. And then, he saw them. Tracks. Fresh, clean, sharp against the smooth sand. Wolf prints. They began at the edge of the pine trees and led straight toward the water. He followed, slow, careful, afraid to breathe too loud, as if he might wake something that shouldn't be disturbed. At the shoreline, the prints continued right into the surf, step after step, until they disappeared beneath the foam. Arthur stopped. His throat tightened. For a moment, he thought he might see a gray shape beyond the waves, but there was nothing, only the endless pulse of the sea, swallowing the evidence, erasing everything but memory. He knelt in the wet sand, one hand brushing the last visible print. It was larger than his palm, perfectly formed, already filling with water. "You made it home," he said softly. "Didn't you?" The sky darkened as rain began to fall again, light at first, then heavier. It soaked his coat, blurred the horizon, and washed the last trace of the wolf away. Arthur stood there until the tide reached his boots. Then he took the old lantern from his bag the small one he'd kept from the tower, and set it gently on the sand. He struck a match, cupping it from the wind, and watched the flame bloom to life. The light wavered, then steadied. For a long time, he simply watched it burn, the glow reflecting in the water like a second sunrise. He thought of the nights he'd spent waiting for ships, for storms, for something wild to answer him from the dark. He thought of the wolf standing beneath the beam, fearless, loyal to something neither of them could name. Maybe that's what faith really was, lighting a flame for someone who might never see it. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of salt and pine and something faintly warm, fur, maybe, or memory. Arthur smiled. "You can rest now, old friend," he whispered. "The light's yours." The flame flickered, danced once in the wind, and then went out, leaving only smoke curling upward, thin as breath, rising toward the gray sky. He turned back toward the cliffs, the sea murmuring behind him. As he walked away, the clouds began to break. Through a thin slit of sunlight, the waves glittered silver. He looked back one last time. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement near the surf, a shadow four-legged trotting along the shoreline. But when he blinked, it was gone. Only the endless ocean remained, and the faint echo of a howl carried on the wind, not sad, not haunting, but free. Arthur stood listening until the sound faded, then smiled through the tears he didn't bother to hide. "Goodbye," he said. And this time, it sounded like peace. Winter came quietly that year. The storms along the Oregon coast had eased, and the ocean for once seemed to sleep. Months had passed since Arthur Hale last saw the lighthouse. He now lived in a small cottage inland, tucked between cedar trees and an old creek that whispered at night. The sea was gone from his windows, replaced by moss and stillness. He told himself that peace was what he'd wanted, but peace he found was another kind of silence. Some nights he'd wake just before dawn, certain he'd heard the hum of the lighthouse in the distance, that low metal sigh it used to make when the wind touched it right. Other nights he'd dream of footsteps in the sand, four prints beside his own leading nowhere. He kept the old lantern on a shelf by the window. Sometimes he lit it just to watch the way its glow reached across the walls. It was a smaller light than the one he once guarded, but somehow it felt enough. One morning while he was making tea, the mail arrived. Among the bills and flyers was a white envelope stamped with a federal seal. The handwriting was neat, almost military. He hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short letter from the Coast Guard. "Mr. Hale, the vessel you signaled during the October storm was identified as the Mariner's Gift. Your light helped redirect their course. All 6 crew members survived. Though your actions violated decommission protocol, we acknowledge that your intervention likely prevented a tragedy. Thank you for your service, both past and present. Jadas, Lieutenant Commander R. Tanner, U.S. Coast Guard." Arthur read it twice, then set it on the table beside his cup. For a long time he didn't move. The words felt heavy and light all at once. He wasn't sure if they meant to forgive him, or if they simply didn't know what else to say. Outside, snow began to fall, slow and soundless. In the following weeks, stories began to circulate. Tourists visiting Yaquina Head reported strange things, paw prints appearing overnight in the sand, though no dogs were allowed in the area. Some said they heard howling from the cliffs at dusk. Others swore they saw a gray shape moving through the fog near the lighthouse, vanishing whenever they called out. The local paper ran another headline, "The Lighthouse Guardian Returns." It was easy to dismiss as folklore, just another ghost story for the coastal towns that fed on legend. But those who'd lived near the cliffs for years knew better. They said the fog had changed since the night of the great storm. It no longer rolled in heavy and blind. Instead, it glowed faintly when the moon rose, as if some invisible lamp still burned within it. Arthur never went back, not truly. He told himself he was too old for ghosts. But one summer evening, long after sunset, he found himself walking down the dirt road that led to the western ridge. He stopped at the last turn, where the sea could just be seen between the trees. The air was thick with salt again, though the wind carried no sound of waves. He stood there for a while listening. Nothing, until from far away, a single clear howl drifted across the hills. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was enough. Arthur smiled that quiet kind of smile that comes when memory and truth meet halfway. "Still watching, aren't you?" he whispered. He turned back toward home, the sound still echoing behind him. That night, he dreamed he was standing inside the lighthouse again. The lamp was lit, casting circles of gold across the walls. Outside, the storm was gone, replaced by calm seas and a full moon. A figure stood beside him, not a man, not a shadow, but the outline of the wolf fur gleaming silver eyes, steady and warm. It looked at him once, then out toward the water. Arthur followed its gaze. Far out on the horizon, a ship moved through the dark, guided by a light that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wolf turned back to him, and in that silent language that exists between souls, he understood. Neither of them belonged to the storm anymore. They belonged to the light. When he woke, dawn was breaking. The old lantern on the shelf was still burning, though he couldn't remember lighting it. Its flame was small, but steady, the same way it had always been. Arthur sat beside it, watching the light dance across the glass. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the keeper of anything lost. He simply felt kept.